Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar. Today, we are going to be looking at how to structure your disclosure in line with the TCFD, specifically looking at CDP disclosure and mainstream reporting through CDSB Framework. I'm Gemma Clements. I work for CDSB, primarily managing the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which I will talk about later. Some general housekeeping for today's webinar. If you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. We should have time at the end to answer some questions. So as you think of those questions, please do put them in to the Q&A. And these slides will be shared after the webinar along with the recording. So on our agenda today, we have Simon Fischweicker from CDP, who's manager of the disclosure services, and he's going to be talking about how CDP disclosure aligns with the TCFD recommendations. I'm then going to talk about how we look at moving that information into the mainstream filings. And then we have Guy Van Sickle from Hannon Armstrong, who works in the public investment team, and he's going to be talking about the work that Hannon Armstrong have been doing, especially around metrics and scenario analysis. Now, most of you will already have an understanding of the TCFD and their recommendations, but I'm going to give you a quick overview as a reminder. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was set up in 2015 to look at how companies are disclosing climate-related information to their investors. In 2017, the TCFD published their final report, which included a set of voluntary recommendations for disclosure in the mainstream report. There are 4 thematic areas and 11 subsequent recommended disclosures, and they fit under those 4 thematic areas, so that's governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. And the TCFD have reiterated a number of times that these recommendations are nothing new. They're not new at all. They've been built on existing reporting frameworks and standards, such as the CDSB Framework and CDP disclosure requirements. And on that note, I'm going to pass on to Simon, who's going to talk about CDP reporting and how it aligns with the TCFD recommendations. Simon, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Gemma, and thanks for setting up this webinar, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone on the line. Again, my name is Simon Fischweicker, and I manage our disclosure services team in CDP's North American office. My team works with the 1,200 or so companies in Canada and the United States that are requested by their stakeholders to disclose to CDP. We help them understand the questionnaires, guidance, and scoring, and provide as a gateway to much of the work that CDP does on disclosure, as well as other areas like supply chain and leadership commitments. Next slide, please. So for today's presentation, I'll focus on providing a very brief introduction to CDP for those on the line that might be less familiar with the organization. I'll try to keep it brief. As I mentioned, most are quite familiar. I'll discuss the steps CDP has taken to align with the TCFD recommendations in our 2018 questionnaire. But I'll spend the majority of my time with you walking through some explanations and examples of how the actual disclosures companies will make to CDP in 2018 are reporting in line with the TCFD recommendations. Next slide, please. So CDP is a global nonprofit that runs a disclosure platform for corporate cities, states, and regions to report on environmental management to their stakeholders, including investors and customers. The organization provides high-quality, relevant data that's fundamental to driving action on key environmental areas. And through this disclosure, CDP is also supporting the companies and investors to understand and address environmental impacts across climate change, deforestation, and water security. We have about 6,000 companies that report annually through CDP to around 650 institutional investors who are signatory to the 3 requests we send out, as well as around 115 customers who request data from their specific suppliers. Next slide. So all this data that's disclosed through CDP's platform has become really critical to moving the world towards the low-carbon economy. It informs portfolio analysis and investment decision-making from asset owners like CalSTRS, CalPERS, New York State Common Retirement Fund, as well as asset managers like BlackRock and TD. It also enables large purchasers such as Walmart or the U.S. Government Service Administration to better understand the environmental risks in their supply chain. And the data underlies many of the sustainability rankings and ESG indices compiled by other groups such as MSCI, ISS, Bloomberg, amongst many others. Finally, it contributes to tracking a lot of the non-state actions that U.S. companies and cities are making to remain aligned with goals set out by the Paris Agreement through such initiatives as the Worst We Are Still In and America's Pledge. And also, it's been an instrumental part of guiding some of the content behind the Global Action Summit, the Global Climate Action Summit, which is actually kicking off today in San Francisco. Next slide. So because CDP has so many of these stakeholders who have been disclosing for so long and using the data for so long, it's very important for us to ensure that the corporate environmental data we collect is able to effectively be utilized to transition us to the low-carbon economy and stay on top of any changes in the marketplace. So aligning with TCFD recommendations were of critical importance to the organization. As Gemma noted, the TCFD recommendations weren't anything entirely new and in fact did align with the majority of CDP's longstanding approach to climate change disclosure. However, it did lead to some modifications of questions and adding some new ones as well, the most impactful being including a question on climate-related scenario analysis, which I think each one of us will have some component of our discussion around. We've also built out a bit more around board-level oversight, and in the risk management section included more questions specific to identification and assessment, adjusting the types of risks being evaluated, so moving from the physical, regulatory, and other to transitional risk, acute physical, chronic physical, and then also looking at kind of the upstream versus downstream risk and opportunity. And finally, in line with how TCFD looked at climate-related financial disclosures, CDP really tried in 2018 to draw more out around the impacts and opportunities that climate change may face for businesses financially and specific to their business, including on products and services, their value chain, investments, operating costs, and other more traditional financial metrics. Next slide, please. Then I think you can kind of go right through to 7 here. So I wanted to talk a bit more about how this is actually operationalized. The TCFD recommendations can be seen as these overarching recommendations for the type of climate-related information that companies and investors should be evaluating. And what CDP has done by aligning with these recommendations is provide a tangible mechanism or a real framework for companies to disclose this information in a standardized format and then give that standardized format to financial decision makers. CDP's guidance that accompanies this questionnaire also provides a bit more nuance to how companies should be approaching these metrics, what the information they should actually be collecting and disclosing on is, that builds further comparability in the data disclosed. And finally, CDP's publicly available scoring methodology in 2018 incentivized best practices around climate change as we have for years, but also is incentivizing a robust TCFD-aligned disclosure that's really collecting the standardized, comparable, and decision-ready TCFD-aligned data that the marketplace is increasingly reliant on and being pushed to incorporate into investment decisions through the TCFD recommendations. Next slide, please. So over the next couple slides, I really want to draw out a few examples not fully comprehensive, but of how CDP operationalized this alignment in 2018. In the governance section, one area of the TCFD recommendations that was focused on board oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. So understanding at the highest levels of leadership how climate change is being assessed is an important indication of how effective any given business may be preparing for potential climate-related risks and the opportunities that are affecting their business today, as well as the future resilience of their business as well. So CDP's question C 1.1 and then the subsequent follow-up questions ask companies to discuss whether or not that board-level oversight was in place, but also to dig into the frequency of those discussions on climate-related issues and discuss the mechanisms that were utilized by the board for ensuring that climate change was actually incorporated into those ongoing board conversations and meetings and decision-making. Next slide, please. In the strategy section, as I previously indicated, one of the most important recommendations from the TCFD was for companies to describe the resilience of the organization's strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios and specifically looking at a 2-degree or lower scenario. So a scenario that's understanding how that company is going to function in a world where we've kept global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. Scenario analysis has obviously been an important component of company risk assessment for years. It's something that risk committees undertake on an annual basis. But as a systemic risk, it's important that all companies are beginning to conduct that same type of scenario analysis with a specific focus on climate change. And so that's why it was an important part of the TCFD recommendations and also one of the most significant changes CDP integrated into our 2018 climate change questionnaire. The question for companies at this point was fairly high level in terms of whether or not they conducted such analysis, and then if they had, to identify the scenarios utilized. And these are publicly available scenarios like the IEA 450 scenario, or if they are using any sort of company proprietary scenarios, discussing those as well. And then talking a bit more about the inputs and assumptions made as part of that scenario analysis and digging slightly into the results as well. But mostly focused kind of on whether or not they're doing it and then the processes by which that scenario analysis is actually being undertaken. Next slide, please. Both the TCFD recommendations and CDP framework do include several components around risk management. And this is one of the key aspects of the TCFD recommendations, focuses specifically on the process companies are taking for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. Risks that companies actually identify and the management of these risks are clearly important for investors when assessing companies, and something that CDP has been including in our climate change questionnaire for many years. However, TCFD also outlined that it was important to understand how companies are actually identifying those risks and assessing their size, scope, and significance to the business. So CDP also decided that this was something that would be important to include in our questionnaire. And the incorporation of these metrics in 2018 is driving more companies to establish formalized processes for their actual identification and assessment of those risks. And it's also going to give investors a better sense of what companies are actually doing to develop the lists of risks that they disclose to their investors and build management processes around. So not just seeing kind of what risks are identified, but going a step further in understanding the process that they're actually taking to get there. Next slide. So metrics and targets were kind of the final component of those overarching areas of the TCFD recommendations. And these have been part of CDP's sort of bread and butter, let's say, for nearly 2 decades. Through the experience CDP has in establishing this database of corporate emissions that includes over 6,000 companies, we've been able to hone in on some key metrics like targets, science-based targets, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, verification, various breakdowns, and year-on-year performance. And in fact, in 2017, CDP and CDSB partnered on a report looking at a global sample of around 2,000 companies, and found that 95% reported either scope 1 or 2 emissions, and 80% disclosed an emissions reduction target. So in some areas, a real strength from the corporate reporting world, but in some areas also some areas for improvement with TC in terms of TCFD aligned metric and target disclosure. Next slide, please. And finally, one area of increasing significance that was highlighted in the TCFD recommendations is scope 3 or indirect emissions. And CDP has long been a strong driver of scope 3 disclosure. And in that time, we've seen an increased focus from both investors and companies on value chain engagement. So this includes understanding companies' upstream emissions from their suppliers, as well as downstream impacts from the use of their sold products. And so this is another area that will continue to be a focus in the years ahead. Next slide, please. And finally, to close out my section, I just kind of wanted to reconfirm how CDP fits into this overall TCFD picture. For one, CDP continues to be an on-ramp for the integration of metrics into financial filings, a place where companies can build internal processes for collecting this data and reporting it so that it can be ready to be brought into financial filings. It's a way for companies who are currently disclosing to CDP to communicate their alignment with these, globally driven TCFD recommendations, and also perhaps a roadmap for organizations to achieve what TCFD ultimately encourages, which is that inclusion of these sorts of disclosures into mainstream financial filings. And CDSB, who will speak next, has been developing the tools and frameworks for companies to do this for years. So with that, I'll hand it back to Gemma, and hopefully she can discuss a little bit more about how companies disclosing to CDP can use those disclosures to move them into the more traditional financial reporting.
Thank you, Simon. It's really helpful what you've been saying to us, and it's really helpful for companies to know that they are likely already collecting and disclosing a lot of this information that the TCFD are asking for. And as Simon said, what I'm going to be talking about now is how that information can then be brought across into mainstream filings. So for those of you who don't know much about CDSB, we are the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and we are a consortium of 9 business and environmental NGOs, and you can see who they are on the screen. We were founded in 2007 with a mission to create the enabling conditions for material information, climate change and natural capital information to be integrated into mainstream reporting. We are mostly known for our framework, which was updated earlier this year. It's written following international accounting standards and includes 7 principles and 12 reporting requirements. If you compare the CDSB framework to the TCFD recommendations, you will see that there are a lot of similarities, which isn't a coincidence. And the CDSB framework was the most referenced reporting framework in the TCFD final report. And we went through the process of making sure that our framework was fully aligned earlier this year. We are also aligned with 20 reporting provisions, including CDP, GRI, and SASB, and I've got a slide a little later on that will demonstrate how we are aligned. The CDSB framework is used by over 370 users from a number of countries and a range of sectors, and it is referenced as a method of compliance in a number of regulations, including the UK Companies Act and the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive. We're also referenced in 5 stock exchanges, including London and Singapore Stock Exchange. So firstly, I need to apologise for this slide because I know that you can't really read the detail on there, but you can access this document. It's an appendix of our framework, but you can also go to that link and you'll be able to see the full document. This is where we have mapped the connections between the major reporting provisions to help companies see how they all align together. So, for example, if a company reports using the GRI standards, they can see quite easily where that information will also fit within another reporting provision. We know that the reporting landscape is very complicated, but we all exist for different reasons, and we all complement each other. And to show how we complement each other, I'm going to show you this diagram. So the TCFD is a massive buzzword at the moment. A lot of companies are talking about it and looking at how they can disclose against the recommendations. And as Simon said, they are telling us what the companies should be evaluating. CDP then helps companies through their disclosure platform and their questions to generate, report and structure their data. CDSB, for example, will help companies understand what is material for the organization and what metrics to use. And then the CDSB Framework helps move the financially material information into mainstream report using the principles and requirements. So this should all be seen as a process of reporting with all these different elements joining together and working together to help create better reporting. Now, some of you will have seen this diagram before. This is the implementation path that's from the TCFD final report, and they envisage that there'll be 5 years for full uptake. So lots of companies are going to be at the beginning stage of this process. We've just finished the first year, and not a huge amount of companies have started reporting. We know that a lot of companies are looking into the TCFD recommendations, but not yet disclosing. And what I want to draw your attention to in particular is the second point on that graph. So companies already reporting under other frameworks implement the TCFD's recommendations. So if you're reporting specifically to CDP, then you are already on the implementation path. And the next step is to get that information into your financial filings. One resource that we've developed earlier this year to help you do that is the TCFD Knowledge Hub. So we created this, and this was launched in May this year with the TCFD. And it's designed to help you find the resources that you need to collect, analyze, and disclose the relevant information. There are over 400 resources that are categorized within our database. But we also have additional pages where you can go in and it breaks the recommendations down a little bit further and provides a little bit more guidance. We are very soon going to be launching the case studies and events page, and I'm very excited about the case studies page because I think that's going to be very helpful. It's a call out now to any company who would like to share what they're doing. Please get in contact with me and I can talk you through how we can build a case study. Talking about case studies, I thought the easiest way to talk about how to get this information into the mainstream report is to show you how other companies are doing it. So I've got some examples from companies who are disclosing generally in their annual reports. But to start with some general points, disclosures are being made through a number of channels. So some are being made through the mainstream report, and some of them are through the sustainability report. Now, we are seeing more and more investors asking for this information to be in the mainstream report as it allows for better comparability and it helps provide a full picture. But as a starting point, putting this information into the sustainability report is not necessarily a bad thing. And what we've seen other companies do is provide reference tables. So where the information exists either in various places within a report or perhaps in separate reports, creating a reference table is a great way to reduce the reporting burden. So rather than reiterating and putting that information into different places, you can have a reference table which will then let the users of the information know where to find it. I've got an example that I can show you in the next slide. We're also finding that integration of information requires more work. So many companies are creating TCFD-specific reports or creating separate sections within their annual reports that is designed just to demonstrate what they're doing in regards to TCFD. Now, again, this might be a great way to start, but eventually what we're looking for is this information to be integrated. If climate change is truly integrated within the business in terms of decision-making, then this should be reflected in the report. And I've also got a few examples to show you how some companies are starting to do this. Financial impacts of climate change is largely implied. So we're seeing a lot of description and we're seeing a lot of qualitative information. We're not seeing a huge amount of quantitative data, which isn't a surprise. We're in the first year, so we wouldn't expect to necessarily see detailed information at this stage. And in the same regard, there are very few disclosures about strategy and resilience. As Simon said, one of the biggest things to come out of the TCFD was the 2-degree scenario analysis. And many companies haven't yet started or are just looking at how to conduct this scenario analysis. So we haven't seen very many companies disclosing this information as of yet. So to get into some of these case studies, the first one is CDL, City Development Limited, who are a real estate company listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. I've shown you this example because of the reference table that I was just talking about. There is other elements of CDL's report, which is really good. But in particular, I wanted to demonstrate their reference table. So they've summarized what they're doing and then referenced out to other places in the report where you can find that information. Now, I've been saying this entire time that this information does belong in the mainstream report, and I've got a little quote there that's come from the TCFD report itself. So the TCFD believes that moving climate-related information into the mainstream filings means that practices, techniques will evolve more rapidly. In particular, it will improve the quality of climate-related financial disclosures and will ultimately support the pricing of risks and the allocation of capital. So we do want to see this information move across. Some of these examples are from sustainability reports. The next example is BHP Billiton, who are a mining company based in Australia. Broadly, their report is very good. It's very well integrated. Unsurprisingly, climate change is quite core to what they do, and they need to consider it within their strategy. And in the top right corner, what you see, as I've done, I've highlighted which TCFD thematic area this covers and which CDP question this covers. This is the 2018 question. So here we're looking at governance in particular, and there's a lot of good information, but I've pulled out these two examples in particular. So there was a clear demonstration of how the board are managing and receive this information and how that's integrated within their decision making. But what I found really interesting is their board skills and experience section. So they have a large section about board skills and experience, and then they have this smaller section within that that's focused on climate change. So we can see what attributes the board have concerning climate change. But at the bottom where I've highlighted, you can also see where climate change is part of the board's decision-making process, including anything to do with strategy, portfolio, and investment decisions. The next example I have, and this goes over 2 slides, is SSE, who are a UK utilities company. And again, climate change is very well integrated throughout their report. In particular here, I'm focusing on the risk management section. And climate-related risk is included within the group principal risk assessment. However, climate change itself isn't pulled out as a specific principal risk. They describe it as a material influencing factor. So the 2 examples that I have there, development and change, energy and infrastructure failure, you'll see in their material influencing factor that climate change features. So in the development one, they talk about transitional risk, so where climate change and the need to generate responsible energy or energy in a responsible way, that is an influencing factor. With energy, infrastructure and failure, at the very top, they have severe adverse weather that causes damage or interrupts energy supply or generation. So there you have physical climate risk as well. At the bottom of their risk management section, they have a paragraph and a statement which just basically tells us that the board has oversight of the entire risk management process, which includes climate change. Following on from that, they have additional sections that that speak further about climate change and its risks to the company. And they include both impacts and dependencies, so mitigation and adaptation. They also talk a lot about transition and physical risks. And if you look at the left-hand side, they have a rather large section about weather conditions and how it will impact on their company. And in particular, what's good about this example is that they explain the processes for how they assess and how they manage that risk. This is mainly to do with physical risk, and there's less information about transition risk. But as a whole, this disclosure is quite mature. The last example I have is State Street, which is a financial service company in the US. And this is their CR report. So it's not their mainstream filings, but they have included it within their CR report. And they've given us a good high-level description of how physical climate risk is assessed and what the impact of that is on the company. What they don't give us is any indication about the length of these or the time frame of these risks. So we don't know whether they are short-term, medium, or long-term risks. They do, however, provide an overview of what the financial impact is. So they give us a descriptive paragraph about how this impacts on business continuity. It does, however, focus mainly, again, on physical climate risk and less on transitional risk. But as a whole, I wanted to show you these so you can see how there are lots of companies at different stages of maturity. Some are able to integrate the information fully, and some are starting out and putting in little bits of information. CDSB has some more information that will help you and support you when you're trying to disclose against the TCFD recommendations. So we have a checklist of 10 important things that you need to think about. I would highlight to you on the left column, the 5th bullet point down, is what we've been talking about today. So look at existing tools you've already been using to collect and report climate-related financial information, such as the CDP questionnaire, and then consider how some of this information can be translated across into your mainstream report. You could do this through a gap analysis, and that leads me on to another service that CDSB has to support you. It's our Beyond Disclosure program, which is designed to help companies look at their current reporting and how it aligns with the TCFD recommendations and CDSB Framework. In particular, it's a 4-stage program. The first stage is we conduct a gap analysis of your mainstream reporting against the TCFD recommendations and CDSB Framework. But we also look at other reporting channels, including sustainability reports and the CDP disclosure. There's a lot of information that's included in the CDP disclosure. There's a lot of detail which might not necessarily be able to transfer into the mainstream filing, but we can look at ways in which you can do that, or we can help you pick out the most important bits of information. We then have an engagement with internal stakeholders. So we interview members from different departments to find out more about the reporting process and procedures. And both those stages then fit into the 3rd stage, which is a report where we provide practical next steps and further case study examples to demonstrate how you might be able to do that. We then provide ongoing support as you try to include this information into your mainstream report. And finally, from me, we have a commitment to implement the TCFD recommendations. It's a We Mean Business commitment, and it's to implement the TCFD recommendations within 3 years. There are a lot of benefits, including being part of the leading companies who share experiences and demonstrate good practice and best practice. And that leads me very nicely onto our next speaker. So if you look in the circle, you'll see the companies who have already committed, and one of those is Hannon Armstrong, who were the first US company to join the commitment. So I'm going to pass over now to Guy, who's going to talk more about the work that Hannon Armstrong are doing.
Great. Thank you, Gemma, and thank you, everyone, for joining on the call today. So, really our focus here, and Gemma, you can jump to the next slide, is, Hannon Armstrong, our focus is investing in assets that reduce carbon emissions, save water, have a positive impact on the environment, and that's our primary screen for all investments, investing about $1 billion a year across energy efficiency, wind, solar, stormwater remediation, which addresses some of the effects of climate change. But though we stand to benefit from some of the opportunities posed under a 2-degree scenario where different regulations are implemented to mitigate climate change, we are investing in fixed assets, and those fixed assets certainly have physical risks associated with them, which we'll kind of step through here. Next slide. So this is just a high level in terms of give you a little better sense of, what we do at Hannon Armstrong and how this might tie into some of the risks and opportunities associated with climate change. So, you'll see up top there energy efficiency and solar PV investments. A lot of those investments are actually both looking to reduce emissions associated with climate change, but also build out resiliency. So the U.S. Marine Corps there at Parris Island, much of their motivation, given they're in a low-lying area, is to install combined heat and power system, battery backup systems in order to address some of the risks associated with climate change. And then you'll see the rest there in terms of distributed solar assets, wind assets, and the sustainable infrastructure. And, though there is, frankly, we're very interested in the TCFD disclosures because we think, we may look positively under this analysis in terms of potentially additional originations and growth in our business model. If you look at something like wind and you think about how does climate change affect the variability from these, the variability of production on those assets, that's a real risk to our portfolio and something that is really important for us to dig into. Next slide. So in terms of reporting to CDP and our process to date, this is something that we've really invested a lot of time in, is looking at how can we quantify our impact and effectively communicate that to our constituents and our investors. So, frankly, we have a easier go at this, given that we are, a 50-person company and only about $5 billion in assets under management. So our Scope 1 emissions, 0, our Scope 2 emissions, nominal and offset with renewable energy credit purchases. But our Scope 3 emissions is where it starts to get interesting, and we actually assess all of the 15 categories across the greenhouse gas protocol guidance published by the World Resources Institute. And when we think about what's really material to us and what might be relevant to our constituents, it's the impact of our investments. So all of our investments are offsetting carbon or saving water. And so what we look at per the World Resources guidance is looking at our equity investments in these projects. So basically our contribution to the total project cost of a wind development in Iowa or a commercial PV project in California, looking at the emissions offset in that particular region based on regional specific emissions factors, and then summing that up across the portfolio to say, all right, on an annual basis, what is the impact of our investments? So, obviously this is something that we're proud of here, that we work to directly communicate that back to our constituents and say, all right, per $1,000 of Hannon Armstrong stock, the associated annual impact of that is offsetting 0.29 metric tons. This is one way that we've incorporated into our CDP reporting in terms of metrics that we think can be very relevant and hopefully standardized across different corporates and certainly investment companies. But again, acknowledge that our undertaking is a little bit easier than a lot of other folks. Next slide. Similarly, we look at our water impact in a comparable way, where we're looking at, all right, what is the impact of our projects in terms of that, $1,000 of Hannon Armstrong stock. Our annual water use as a company, pretty boring there. It's simply what we're using for domestic purposes and our dishwashers and things like that. But the other side of this that is definitely more interesting is, we make a lot of energy efficiency investments, low flow water fixtures, and the associated impact there in terms of reducing potable water consumption. And then the one that we're still evaluating and is part of our scenario analysis is looking at, all right, our projects, what is our exposure, let's say on a commercial solar project in California that needs to be washed, on a quarterly basis to remove dust and improve efficiency? And what is the sensitivity to the operating profile of the project in terms of cash flows? So we're really trying to get to, all right, how can we make this tangible? How can we think about this in NPV of cash flows to Hannon Armstrong? Next slide. And so the way that we've kind of broken up and started evaluating our portfolio is thinking about, really for us, what's kind of our upside scenario, that there's regulation to stay within a 2C temperature band, and then looking at what are the associated inputs that we might flow through our portfolio model in that case. Again, this is somewhat simplified here, but I think, from our perspective, it's how can we come up with what we think are material inputs, run them through the portfolio, be punitive, and do a good job of disclosing all of what we're putting in, as opposed to, really harping on the accuracy of those inputs. What we think is more important is really providing a clear test, a clear disclosure of assumptions, and then providing clear outputs in our financial disclosures. So some of the things you'll see here, assuming that in our wind projects, we use a power curve that assumes a $40 escalating carbon tax, increased price of renewable energy credits, decline in COE, and then looking at, all right, the potential market of these renewable energy technologies, energy efficiency grows. How can we think about what that means for the amount that we're able to put out the door in investments every year? On the flip side, we have, what for us is really more the downside scenario, where regulations are not implemented, and for these projects, looking at what are some of the, really for us, it's physical risks. So shifting of a 100-year floodplain to a 10-year floodplain, incidents of wildfires, variability in winds, and then really at the end of the day, what are we evaluating? So for us, it's kind of a two-tiered test where we have percentage of portfolio assets that are exposed to a risk, and then we look at what is the actual NPV change in Hannon Armstrong cash flows. So with those two tests, we think we can get to a sense of, all right, how efficiently are we managing this risk? Is it within an acceptable band? And is that acceptable to our investors and our constituents? And fundamentally, this process is overseen by our Chief Accounting Officer, and who directly reports to our Board of Directors and the Risk Committee there. Next slide. So continuing down here, this is, again, I think one of the more straightforward risks, but hopefully this can give you a thought of how we would go about assessing a portfolio. So fundamentally, we look to bucket our assets that fall within a particular risk exposure. In this case, we're thinking about storm severity and flooding risk. So in this case, we bundled all of our assets that fall within the 100-year floodplain using the Bloomberg mapping function and our project zip code. So basically flag all of these assets. We say, continuing on to the next step 2, we're just going to assume that all assets within this floodplain catastrophically fail due to a flooding event, severe storm surge at some point over the next 20 years. And then we'll assume a payout in insurance proceeds, 18 months after the event. We'll then look at, all right, what was calculate the NPV of the assets in that new floodplain, and then we'll calculate the change in NPV of cash flows associated with that flooding event. Again, trying to think of how can we quantify this in a way that it's not necessarily going to be, we can't spend too much time on trying to figure out exactly what those floods will look like, but this is a scenario we can test to give our constituents an understanding of what is the type of exposure and breadth of the exposure that they maybe should be thinking about. And then finally, again, looking at assessing, is that change in MPV acceptable within the established band? And if not, how should we think about this more broadly? What does this mean in terms of insurance coverage, limiting regional exposure? And this is something that I think, our process internally has really motivated some interesting discussions across business groups. Next slide. So high level, this has kind of been our approach to date and how we think about this. We are trying to get to a tangible, financial impact associated with these risks and think about it, in the same way that we might think about interest rate risk. Though obviously that's a little bit easier to quantify, helping our portfolio managers and our board understand, all right, these are the most material risks, and how do we prioritize them and test within a certain number of limits. One thing that we think is really important here is getting in a good working group across expertise, so not just the portfolio management folks or the engineering folks, but getting legal in there to talk about, what do our insurance contracts really look like. And then testing extremes, so, get punitive with these scenarios, but really just do a good job of disclosing there. And then finally, I think the big one is how well are we managing this risk? So, we have fundamental asset exposure, but the NPV of assets exposed versus actual change. So, as we think about, some of our challenges here, this flood risk, is one that you say, okay, that's pretty straightforward. I get that. What we're looking at that's a little bit more complex is as you see the blending of risks. So in our wind portfolio, potential increases in variability in wind speeds, paired with additional wear and tear on turbines due to storm events, and how do you either isolate those events or kind of blend them together. So I think I can stop there, and then maybe we can jump into some questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Guy. And it's always great to hear what companies are doing to try and tackle these complex issues, especially around scenario analysis. And leading on, so I'm going to go straight into the question and ask. I'm going to ask the question based on the last thing that you said. You say that storm severity and flooding is straightforward, and wind in particular is quite challenging. How are you, when you're looking at how you're assessing these risks, what are you trying to do to make the challenge less challenging?
Yeah, so for us, it's less time spent on, all right, we're going to assume a variability change of 7.56% in our wind projects. And alternatively, we're going to say, we're going to assume, this, for us, it's really about how can you standardize and simplify the assumptions going in the model, disclose those really well, and say, this is what we tested. We think this is representative of what might happen, as opposed to getting bogged down and trying to get into too much climate modeling, if that makes sense. So that's been one approach there. On the wind side is just assuming, a specific example is assuming that, as opposed to using our, P75 assumption, we jump to P90 assumption in terms of production. So just assume a haircut to production and an increase in O&M costs of 5%, and kind of run it through the portfolio models and see what happens. And then we can have follow-up conversations with our investors, or they can run their own tests and say, hey, we don't think that's punitive enough. What if you run this? That's sort of been our approach for the more complex ones. Similar with wildfire risk, we look at what assets are in those kind of wildfire regions, and we just assume that at some point during their 20-year life, which is really the life of our investments, that there will be some sort of catastrophic event.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. We've got quite a few questions, so I'm gonna jump between Simon and Guy. I'm gonna ask you both questions one at a time. So if I turn to you now, Simon, we've been asked if a company is preparing a TCFD compliant response using CDP, can they answer the how discussion topics associated with identifying climate-related risk?
Good question, and I think I understand the question, so I'll give an answer, but if whoever asked that question doesn't get the answer they're looking for, feel free to type any follow-up in there. I think, the short answer is yes. And essentially, as I outlined in my slides, some of the questions that we've added this year specifically discuss or ask companies to discuss their process for identifying climate-related risks. So by answering that question, first you are disclosing information that is in line with that recommended disclosure, and then if you're looking to pull that into mainstream filings, as we've been discussing on this call, you should be able to pull the information, and I think CDSB would have more details on exactly how to do this, but you would be able to pull that response and that information into the mainstream filing, and ideally through your process of completing the CDP questionnaire, you are having those conversations internally and asking, what are our processes for identifying climate-related risks, and potentially establishing new ones to respond to those questions, or just getting further clarity on that process, and then enabling you to discuss it both in the CDP questionnaire as well as the TCFD report. Gemma, anything to add from the CDSB perspective on that?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with everything that you've said, and it's looking at the processes in which your company is, so disclosing the processes in which your company is assessing this risk, which is important. And the information that you have in your CDP response is actually for that particular question, is quite easy, I think, to move across. The only challenge that I foresee, and the challenge that I've spoken to other companies about, is the fact that the risk management section is often very big, and where climate-related risk isn't a principal risk, isn't one of the biggest risks that your company faces, it's often not deemed material enough to go into the mainstream report, which in itself is a fair assessment. But if you wanted to include that information in your mainstream report, you could either have a separate section that includes that directly from your CDP response, or you can speak to your risk management team and see how that information would align with what you're already doing. If you wanted more information about how, the step before that, how to integrate climate into your risk management process in the first place, I would direct you to the TCFD Knowledge Hub. And if you click on to the risk management section, we've broken down the recommendations a little bit further, and at the very bottom we've got some resources that may help you identify the risks that you're looking for. Brilliant, thank you, Simon. I'm going to turn back to you, Guy, and the questions come in. How has the TCFD scenario analysis started to impact your investment process?
Sure, yeah. So, it's definitely been an interesting process thus far, and bringing in a variety of groups. Some of the things that we think about as we look at this, we had additional conversations around insurance and our insurance assumptions in some of our solar projects and wind projects, right? Because not only are we facing the potential risk associated with increased wildfires or flooding or whatever it might be, but also potentially increases in the cost of those insurance products and even the ability to get those insurance products. Oftentimes insurance agreements are executed on an annual basis, and so there's that kind of ongoing unpredictability as to what that might look like going forward. So we think that we're thinking about kind of adding additional sections in terms of climate risk to investment committee memos and presentations as we actually pitch projects to our investment committee and our board for approval.
Brilliant, thanks, Guy. I've got another one for you, Simon. Question: if we report, so the company's asking, if we're reporting against TCFD in our mainstream report, do we need to continue disclosing to CDP? That one's for you, Simon.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so a good question there, and I think my short answer is yes again. But unlike regulated financial filing, CDP is a voluntary reporting framework. So it's a decision companies make. However, I guess there's kind of three core components of why I see companies who are reporting against some of the TCFD recommendations or continuing to disclose to CDP. I think for one, CDP's questionnaire is not just a questionnaire, it's a reporting system. So it provides investors, customers, and the entire ESG marketplace with a database of these standardized and comparable, now TCFD aligned data and metrics. Another is the recommendations that TCFD put out, and kind of as Jem has indicated, the level of data that sometimes can be carried over into mainstream reports might not go as in-depth as CDP's questionnaire does on climate change, deforestation, and water. And so there are investors that are looking to do more deeper analysis, and customers through the supply chain are looking to have a better understanding of kind of a more complete picture of the level of risk and opportunity out there for them. And so CDP provides that deeper dive in a standardized and comparable way again that provides more context around company environmental performance and then kind of an aggregate benchmarking ability across entire industries and countries and sectors, et cetera. And then I think also the fact that CDP scores responses makes it important for those companies, even if they are doing this sort of TCFD reporting in mainstream filings, because the publicly available scoring methodology and corresponding score provides investors, customers, and other stakeholders a pretty easy to understand snapshot of the level of their disclosure and their actions on climate change. So not just how much are they reporting, but what are they actually doing. And it also, in turn, provides companies a sort of action-oriented roadmap towards improvement, towards leadership. So I think for that reason, there continues to really be a strong demand from shareholders and company and customers for companies to report this sort of information, and a real benefit for them to do so.
Yeah, I agree, and I would reiterate your point and say that all of the reporting standards, including CDSB, CDP, and the TCFD, we are all very much complementary, and we work together as part of a wider reporting process. So it's definitely not one or the other, and I think there are benefits of doing both. And in fact, as I've demonstrated, if the reporting burden becomes too much, especially at the beginning stages, companies have reference where their CDP disclosure is publicly available. They have referenced in the annual report to their CDP disclosure to find that information. So certainly it all fits together as one big reporting family. And on that note, we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank you all for joining, and I hope you found the information informative. As a reminder, you will be emailed the slides and the recording shortly, and if you have any further questions, do please get in contact, and we will endeavour to answer them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much.